Ken Levine is an American game developer. He is the creative director and co-founder of Ghost Story Games, and he led the direction or creation of the Bioshock series and is also known for his work on Thief, The Dark Project, and System Shock 2. He is an incredibly accomplished developer. Okay, he's been tied to a lot of the most well-respected games in the last like 20 years. I mean, he's responsible for some amazing work. And apparently, according to some people that have worked with him, he's absolutely insane. Like he's crazy in a lot of good ways, and then also a lot of bad ways as well, according to like the executives that try to work with him. Basically, he seems like a classical creative type that is a very skilled creator of things. But when you try to put him on rails and try to get the product out the door, he's a little bit harder to work with. So as it just said, he worked on the Bioshock series. And one of the most interesting things about Bioshock is specifically Bioshock Infinite. So he worked on Bioshock in 2007, and then he worked on Bioshock Infinite and Burial at Sea as the lead writer and the creative director on both projects. Creative director pretty much just deciding like what the game is going to look like. Sometimes you also have a game director that comes in and like helps with stuff. Notably, Neil Druckmann was the creative director on The Last of Us, but they also had Bruce Straley, who was like in charge of the gameplay and the actual functioning there. And then same thing with Uncharted 4. They worked on that, where Neil Druckmann was the creative director, coming up with the actual layout of the game and the design of the missions. Well, not necessarily the minutia of the missions, but the settings and kind of the themes of it. And then Bruce Straley would go in and then he'd create the gameplay and try to make it fun and engaging to play. So sometimes you have the creative director and a gameplay director. Other times you'll just have a creative director. It just depends on how the studio's set up. But the point is, Ken Levine was responsible for a lot of the big choices in Bioshock. I would argue a lot of the choices that made it really notable and interesting, especially with the original Bioshock story writing and creative direction. I mean, the themes within Bioshock are what really set it apart and what really make it successful, and that was all him. So he does deserve a lot of credit for that. However, there is a really interesting story with the development of Bioshock Infinite, specifically that it was kind of a nightmare for everybody working on it. And most of it came back to Ken Levine. And a lot of it just has to do with being a perfectionist, trying to hone in on exactly what they were trying to do. And then he would change his mind, and it was just kind of a disaster. And one of the best ways to see this is with a video from Crowby Cat or Crowby Cat. I don't know how they want it to be pronounced, but specifically with this Bioshock Infinite, the Bioshock Infinite we never got. And this is just a short 7-minute video that goes through the original pitch basically of Bioshock Infinite and then shows how it ended up. Because if you've never played this game, you might not be aware, but basically the final version of the game that we ended up getting was very different from the version that was originally discussed and basically pitched to, I'm sure, the executives and then also to the mass gaming public. It ended up being for the better because Bioshock Infinite was, in my opinion, probably the best game of 2013. It was amazing. It was fantastic. However, this is bad because they basically restarted development like 2 or 3 times. Like they had to redo stuff all the time because he would just change his mind on how he wanted the story to work or whatever the plot twist was going to be or certain gameplay elements, and they just had to go back and rework it all.
1990s as a sort of a floating World's Fair, something they could float from one corner of the earth to the other and demonstrate to the rest of the world the success of the American experiment.
7 years ago.
Keep looking, Lincoln.
And what happened was there was a power struggle within Columbia, and this fellow who you sort of start to get a sense of in this demo, named Comstock, came into power in the city, and he had a bit of a different view. He had a more I guess, extreme view of what the mission of America and the world is. And there were some people in the city who didn't like that. And that group was Vox Populi.
Here you go, you sons of bitches! Your homes are ours! Your lives are ours! Your wives
And it started as a sort of a resistance, almost like a student movement against, the founders, the founders group that Comstock led, as, working to help, to unionize workers, to protect the rights of minorities, things like that within the city. But as the conflict between the founders and the Vox Populi got more extreme, each side started sort of ramping up their actions.
Hey, little girl. Yeah.
Where you going? Come on.
Booker.
Listen, friend. We're not looking for any trouble.
Yeah.
And by the time you get to Columbia and you'll see the Vox Populi in the demo, the conflict is pretty extreme, and both sides have a bit of an attitude of, well, as long as we win, nothing else matters. And you encounter the founders last time and sort of got a sense of the dark side of them. And this time you'll encounter Daisy Fitzroy, who's the leader of the Vox Populi.
And so initially it seems like the game was themed and obviously taking a lot of nods from like concepts of typical revolutions, like most notably maybe the French Revolution or something like that. And, really simple power dynamics and the shifting sands between those two. And then later on, it seemed like they started to get into this idea of like different timelines and time travel, and then bouncing between rifts. And it seemed like they got the idea to do this. Maybe they built a concept in terms of gameplay, and then they got that in the game, and it was actually, oh, this is really cool. So they reworked it all, and it just slowly morphs and changes throughout the years. Now, it's true, games change all the time during development. All the time. Like, no game at the start of development is going to be identical to what it is at the end of development. However, you normally don't start talking about the game until you know what it's going to be. It's very, very rare to go on like a media campaign discussing the story and the ideas and themes and gameplay of your title, and then for the final product to be totally different, or at the very least heavily altered. But that's part of what happens when a developer kind of shifts and changes what they're trying to do over time. And this is also, it brings to mind with like Starfield, Emil Pagliarulo, the kind of right-hand man to Todd Howard, he said that Bethesda Game Studios intentionally does not use a game design document. They don't use documentation. And the reason that that's important is because when you don't have a design doc, there's no real way to explain clearly to people that are new to the team or that are within the team and just looking for clarification what the tone is supposed to be, what mission structures they should be trying to do, what gameplay elements they'll have at their disposal, what types of things they should be putting into different side quests at this particular point in the game. There's just very little clarity there. And so as a result, you end up with a game that's very disjointed and that it feels like it's kind of thrown together because there wasn't a clear vision put out front right at the start. In the case of Bioshock Infinite, I think there was a mixture of things. On the one hand, there were people that knew what the vision of the game was, but it was constantly changing and altering, so it was never really clear for people working on it. Okay, are we doing what we were doing like in the summer, or now have things changed now that we're in the spring? Like what's it looking like? I will say though, if you look back at these trailers, this trailer's from March 18th of 2013. Just look at this trailer for Bioshock Infinite. It's only a minute long. But man,
Num, 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 num. Na 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 na
like, come on.
Bioshock Infinite, in stores March 26th.
I would be excited for that game if that trailer dropped today. I mean, I'd be thrilled. I think that's a great trailer. It seems like so many trailers now are just so like soulless. There's just not much there. But there's a lot of trailers like that are just awesome. This original trailer from this was uploaded August 13th of 2010. Irrational Games. Three years. Ooh. And the music in these games, man. The music. Oh. Like the little nod at the front of it to be like, ooh, see, this is Bioshock. And then they transition to this and you're like, what the hell? Like this trailer has aged so well. Isn't it crazy? Granted, this is a cinematic trailer, but still. Hang on! So she can use the Force. Like, come on. Come on. Is that not a fantastic trailer? That's so good. It's so good. So good. So that's kind of like the rundown on the development of Bioshock Infinite. Within it, more specifically, they say like the concept work on Infinite began in February of 2008, 5 years before it launched. Now, back in 2008, 5 years to develop a game was a very, very long time. Now it's pretty standard. Like now a lot of these big games on the AAA scale are going to take 4 or 5 years to put together. It's just kind of what's normal. But back then that was pretty rare. I mean, you think back just to like the lineup of some of the biggest games at the time, whether it's like from Oblivion to Fallout 3 was like 2 years. Like 2006 to 2008, like 2 years to make that game. Only 2 years. Isn't that crazy? And then from like Fallout 3 to Skyrim, 3 years. And then it starts getting longer and longer the closer to the modern day we get. But still, 2K granted Irrational a great degree of creative and financial freedom to develop the next game because they had just made 2 bangers in a row. So they're like, yeah, blank check, here you go. Irrational considered several settings for the game, including reusing Rapture or setting the story in the Renaissance period before deciding on the floating city of Columbia. Can you imagine a Renaissance period for Bioshock? Like, what would that look like? I guess maybe you'd be working with like, they could do something where you're working with Leonardo da Vinci and he creates all these gadgets for you, you know, go full on Assassin's Creed with it, but that could be cool. Anyway, while the setting of a floating city would remain consistent, the time period, characters, and the story itself remained undefined as the team churned through different ideas. Designers and artists would sometimes spend months developing ideas that would be scuttled within minutes after priorities shifted or Levine changed his mind. Oh, Levine's creative process was described as brilliant, but time-consuming, as he focused on very small details. One department within Irrational ran dress rehearsals for any meetings with Levine. At the same time as the story mode was undergoing constant revisions, a set of multiplayer modes was also being designed. The first mode, Border Control, was a tower defense game intended to be set within the game's world. The other multiplayer offering, codenamed Spec Ops, would have been a cooperative mode with up to 4 players. Matches would take place on maps that would evolve after release, using environmental storytelling to depict Columbia's evolving civil war. Weird. Wacky, almost like live service. It's crazy. Irrational began hiring and expanding its team. One notable missing person from the original Bioshock team was John Che, who had worked with Levine since their days at Looking Glass Studios in the 1990s and who headed the Australian branch of Irrational. The two developers' differing aptitudes meant that the two teams had what Che called a synergy, with Che's team emphasizing technical ability while Levine's team was more creative-minded. Dissatisfied with the questions of what Irrational's next project would be, and dissatisfied with the dynamics of a large company, Che left 2K in 2009. Che's departure meant that Levine had to shoulder more production-focused work in opposition to his creative focus, and the staff buildup in Levine's estimation shattered the company culture in the process. Quote, managing 30 or 40 people where you know everybody's name is a very different process than managing 150 people. You walk by people in the studio and you don't know who they are, which makes sense. And this is something we've seen with a lot of these companies, that once they go from like a small team to a very big team, or a small company to a very big company, they sort of check out and they're like, this is just not for me. And we've even seen this type of attrition within really big companies relatively recently. We saw it with, like, for example, ZeniMax. After they were bought by Xbox, you had a lot of people who, granted, probably got pretty good bonuses when Xbox bought them. I'm just saying, it makes sense that people high up within studio leadership at some of the most successful studios within ZeniMax all of a sudden are like, yeah, I think I'm going to retire. Even though I'm only like 47, I'm going to retire now. Like, they probably got a pretty good payout. I'm just saying. But that being said, a lot of it, and they've spoken about this, is like, it's very different going from a company that's relatively small that has 100 employees or 200 employees to then go and be owned by Microsoft, and you have to do conference calls with Microsoft executives on the regular, and you have to follow all of their policies and use their tech. And maybe your team used Google Docs because it was just really easy and native to your whole process because everybody used Google Docs natively. And then all of a sudden you get bought by Xbox and everybody has to switch over to Microsoft Word and like little bitty things like that. Oh, we use Discord to talk as a team. Too bad you're using Teams now. Like, everything just shifts because of a small, like seemingly small stuff starts to compound, where all of a sudden you were used to doing things all these different ways and they have to be done totally differently because there's a new boss in town. So there's just a lot of little stuff like that that can compound it. And more than that, more than anything, creative types are very different to manage than engineers and stuff. And this is something that's been discussed a lot in the video game industry. There's a lot of books on video game development that break this down specifically. And in the context of like my degree being in corporate finance, I took management courses and stuff. So like we were technically trained on this and discussed this at length, but it wasn't like my specialty. But in those management classes, they have whole like weeks and weeks of classes and trainings specifically on managing creatives versus like more intellectuals or engineer types. Because talking to engineers about like, hey guys, we need to do this, this, and this, and these goals aren't being met, and we have to finish this project on time. Let's get it. That's very different than talking to a team of like graphic designers who tend to be a little bit more, the way my professor described it, he was like, creative types are just delicate. He's like, because they work in emotions and feelings and evoking those things, they often have a much more sensitive sense of emotion and feeling. So he's like, if you go in there and you tell an engineer, hey, this sucks, can we figure out a way to fix it? They're going to be like, yeah, it does suck. Let's figure out a way to fix it. If you go up to like a graphic designer and you say, hey, this thing you drew sucks, can we fix it? Said the exact same way, that person that was the creative type tends to respond in a much more negative way. And having worked in both sides of this, in finance at a bank, in commercial real estate as a broker, and then also doing what I do now, working with all sorts of like video editors and designers and graphic designers and stuff, they are very different. Managing the different types of people is very, very different. And when you go from managing like 30 to 40 creative types that are only focused on like the creative process, going into like a team of 150 people and then being forced to manage the technical side of it too, when you previously have not had to bother with it, you can get into some real trouble. And it seems like that is part of the issue. Irrational worked in secrecy on Infinite for 2.5 years prior to its announcement, teasing the game with the moniker Project Icarus. The game was announced at a press event on August 12, 2010 in New York City, where journalists were shown a teaser trailer and Levine outlined the basic story of the game. These were followed by several demos and showcases of the game at events in 2011. The 2011 Electronic Entertainment Expo, or E3 as you might remember it, demo was intended to communicate what kind of game Infinite would be not only to players, but also to the staff itself. While the demo was highly praised, it was also not an indicator of the game's current state. The demo was carefully rehearsed and encounters heavily scripted, as the game's AI was not in a functional state. The game was still undergoing a troubled development. While the big picture elements of the story were now locked, Levine continued to make changes to large parts of the game at a whim, despite the expanding costs of development and additional staff. The game was not getting closer to completion. Again, like, they would be making progress, people are praising the trailers, and then he would just change stuff. Just like, actually, we're going to do it this way. And they're like, you can't just do that. We're trying to, like, lock stuff in. He's like, I changed my mind. I don't like it. Figure it out. And it caused a lot of problems. Within Irrational, there was a concern that the game would never be finished. The game's ship date repeatedly slipped and staff left the company. Jordan Thomas, a former Bioshock level designer who had been creative director for Bioshock 2, was hired in January 2012 to get the project back on track. Levine and Thomas created a roadmap for the game, deciding on cuts to reduce the scope of remaining work. This included the entirety of the multiplayer feature, with the staff relocated to the single player portion of the game. Thomas was followed in March 2012 by game producer Don Roy, experienced with closing out games at publishers like Sony and Microsoft. Roy said that there was no playable game available for him to try when he asked. There wasn't a playable build. Oh, baby. Oh, that's... For 2012, after 4 years of development, that's wild. That's wild. Not even like a playable internal version of the game. We're not talking about like a demo ready for release publicly. We're talking about an internal playable version for testing and stuff. There wasn't anything like that for him to do. That's crazy. Roy created a new workflow to bring order to Infinite's disorganized and inefficient project management. Irrational hired Rod Ferguson as vice president of development in August of 2012. Ferguson has had a reputation of someone who made tough decisions to ship difficult games and reined in Levine's worst tendencies. Irrational staff recalled Levine worked best when under constraints, and that without Ferguson, the game might not have shipped. Thomas left Irrational in November with the game on track to release. He just comes in, fixes it up, and then heads out. But this is, a lot of creative types are kind of like this, and this is one of my frustrations with like Kojima, is I feel like Kojima as a writer needs somebody to rein him in, because I feel like the 30-minute cutscenes rambling, describing basically nothing, actively harm the game in the public eye. And I think if he were able to write wacky stories, it could still be great, but I think it would be more focused and more people would connect with it. I felt like for Death Stranding, it was just like there was so much bloat, specifically narratively, that it just was a total waste of time often. So yeah, I think a lot of these creative types need somebody to rein them in. Otherwise they just go crazy and just add things and change their minds. And it's just very different to actually get a project out the door. To finish the game, Irrational entered a period of sustained crunch. One staffer estimated he spent most of the final year of development putting in 12-hour work days for a year. Content such as vigors, tear mechanics, weapons, locations, characters, and other enemies were cut from the game. Enough material for 5 or 6 whole games, according to one developer. After the game was released to manufacturing, more than a dozen staff voluntarily left Irrational, with the number accelerating as the game's post-launch content began development. Voluntarily, just being like, I'm out. I'm good. This sucked. And moving on. Like, that's crazy. Let's see. The game ultimately took 5 years to make and involved a team of around 200 from Irrational, in addition to support from outside studios. Infinite would be the last game Irrational would make in the series, as much of Irrational's staff was fired in 2014 and the studio was rebranded as Ghost Story Games. The intellectual property would remain within 2K. And this is one thing that I think a lot of people maybe might struggle with, is that just because a game is like really popular does not necessarily mean that it was worth it for the company that made it. In its first week of release, Bioshock Infinite was the best-selling game on Steam's digital top 10 PC charts. In the US, Bioshock Infinite was the top-selling console game for March of 2013 with more than 878,000 units sold, and these figures do not include digital sales such as through Steam. Take-Two reported that the game had shipped 3.7 million copies to retail by their May 2013 financial report and surpassed 4 million in late July. According to Take-Two Interactive, the game has sold more than 6 million as of May 2014 and 11 million a year later. That'll do. During the first week of sales in the UK, Bioshock Infinite debuted as the number one selling PC game, blah, blah, blah. They go through the charts. As of April 2nd, 2013, it is currently the second biggest launch of 2013 after Tomb Raider in the UK, blah, blah, blah. They break it all down. Now, obviously, there's a ton of amazing reception. It made, got tons of awards. It was nominated for tons of stuff. And I think it was totally fair because it really was a fantastic game. However, as you can see, this was a massive undertaking. That was a huge headache for Take-Two, and they probably were not that confident, especially with dev times increasing. They were not that confident that Ken Levine would be able to make just another Bioshock and just get it out the door efficiently. Like they were like, you make great games, but it takes you twice as long as your contemporaries, and the projects restart all the time. And again, remember when we were saying one of the most valuable things to a studio is not necessarily just the singular guy at the top of the company. It's the dev talent. And if you are a creative type or a leader that causes the talent to flee when the game's done with development, that's a problem. That is a huge problem. There's different numbers that have been tossed around by all sorts of different businessmen, and it depends on how you count it. So you can kind of twist the numbers various ways. But one of the common things that's said in business is that it is far more expensive to hire a new employee than to retain a previously employed employee. Not just because of the cost of signing bonuses in highly competitive industries, but also the process of actually finding the talent, the time lost finding the talent, needing to spend time paying managers and stuff to interview and negotiate with them and get them on the team. And then often there's relocating costs to actually pay them to move to the studio. If you're trying to work in the office, there's usually some sort of compensation for that. There's also added costs just for training, because the person's going to show up to work on the first day. They need to be told what the game is supposed to be, what they're going to be doing. They need to be shown how the tools work. What are the procedures? What are the policies for data protection? Okay, am I allowed to have my work email on my personal laptop? If so, what are the security measures I need to take? There's all of these other things that come in for these really complex operations. Just imagine getting hired to go work on GTA 6, and you get hired in while it's still all locked down and not announced yet. Just imagine the amount of very careful training they have to put you through, and then all of the very specific things they have to do to keep you in this small bubble so you don't see this bubble over here, so you can't leak stuff, causing too much problems. It's just very, very complicated. And by some metrics, some books and professors will say it's 5 times more expensive to hire new talent and new employees compared to keeping old talent and employees. Others will say it's 20 times more expensive to hire a new employee versus retain one. It just depends on how you twist the numbers. But all of that to say, it's very, very expensive to lose talent. And in the case of the games industry, it's all the more expensive because there's basically a fixed amount of talent within the industry. There are amazing devs, but there's not always a steady flow of amazing devs back into the industry. There are very talented people, but it takes those people a handful of years to get their feet under them to the point where they can join any team around the world and be able to really contribute meaningfully. It's why you see some of these top designers and game developers bouncing from major studio to major studio to major studio instead of those studios just hiring new talent right out of college because they want experience. That's very valuable to them. So that's another added cost to somebody like Ken Levine at these big companies, is that he's actually burning through talent, and the talent is hey, we don't this was miserable. We're glad that it won all these awards, was super well received. I'm glad that I can put this on my resume, but this was awful. This was a miserable process. That's a problem. That's a huge problem. So all of that to say, what's Ken Levine doing now? Well, after he finished at Irrational with Bioshock Infinite, some interesting things happened. So on February 18th of 2014, Levine announced that Irrational Games would be closing down, with 15 members of the staff to follow Levine to focus on digital-only, narrative-driven games for Take-Two. Levine stated in a 2016 interview that the stress of managing Infinite's development had affected his health and personal relationships, and rather than stay on to lead an even larger Bioshock game, he opted to depart from it. Levine's current project involves a concept of narrative Legos that can be used to create an endlessly replayable, story-driven video game. Interesting, whatever that means. Ghost Story Games. On February 23rd of 2017, Irrational Games was rebranded as Ghost Story Games, founded by 12 of the former Irrational members, with Levine remaining as president and creative director. In January 22, the studio's game was reported to be in development hell, with employees blaming Levine for a lack of leadership in producing a vaguely pitched game that Levine described as narrative Lego, in which every player would have a unique experience. On December 8th of 2022, they revealed their game, Judas. He's sensing a pattern. He's sensing a pattern. Like, this is just, there are some developers and some creative types that are so amazingly talented, and yet they usually have one big problem or one albatross around their neck. And in this case, it seems like that's precisely what's happened, is that Ken Levine is an amazing developer, but he consistently has this problem of clear leadership and retaining talent that is not going to get pissed. So they released this trailer on December 8th of 2022. How they describe it is a disintegrated starship, a desperate escape plan. You are the mysterious and troubled Judas. Your only hope for survival is to make or break alliances with your worst enemies. Will you work together to fix what you broke, or will you leave it to burn? And then in all caps, fix what you broke. Ghost Story.
The ship is dying. And my only way out of here is with one of them.
Sailing to that distant shore, leave the Johnny Fever as the main tower gets to the ocean floor, and it's time for us to leave her. Leave her, Johnny, leave her. Oh, leave her, Johnny, leave her. Oh, the flowers die, and you
People say I have this coming. And you know what? They're right.
Now I ask you, pray tell, what the hell is that about? I have no idea. I have no clue what that means. So my impression, especially with him having described it previously as like narrative Lego, the only thing, so Lego, you have a bunch of pieces and you can arrange them however you want to make different things. So I would assume he means that there's a bunch of different like stories or characters and plot elements within Judas that can then be pieced together to try and solve like the mystery or in this case, fix what you broke. So it seems like maybe something happens at the start of the game that causes like this starship to collapse or implode, causing everybody to die. And then the game is you trying to figure out a way to kind of piece this story together in a way that undoes what you broke and undoes the issue. Interesting concept. To me, it just sounds kind of like Deathloop. If you recall how that game worked, where things like you have this time loop mechanic and the goal basically is to solve the time loop mechanic and break free of it. And so when you start the game, you have no idea really what you're doing. But by the end of the game, you have a very specific order. You have to go through all of the events of the day in order to kind of construct the story in the proper way to break free. Interesting concept. I don't know how this will play out in comparison. I will say artistically, it seems interesting enough. I like the kind of art style. I like the setup of it all. They seem to have actual like in-game models shown instead of purely cinematic stuff. I do think that this bit at the very front is cinematic. This doesn't appear to be necessarily running in real time, but maybe it is. I'm not sure. This stuff definitely is running within the game engine. But you can see, I mean, this is straight out of Rapture. It looks very, very Bioshock-esque. And then they show other elements like the hand abilities right here. Again, extremely inspired by Bioshock. And it might just be that this was their attempt to kind of create a new IP with the foundations laid out in Bioshock. But I mean, you can tell it looks very, very similar in a lot of ways to Bioshock. Not that that's a bad thing, but it's just very similar. However, it's unfortunate that it appears that Judas is falling victim to the same difficulties as previous games. It's unfortunate. The way it's described, Judas is the debut title for Ghost Story Games, which is just a reformed version of the previous studio, but they lost all their employees, so it's basically a new studio, even if it might legally be the just new version of a previous one. It's founded by Ken Levine following a shutdown of Irrational Games, developer of Bioshock. The game's concept started in 2014 when he talked and explained his ideas that they would want to try working on a game during the Games Developer Conference with Narrative Lego, where they can alter story elements they can use to make a very replayable game with multiple outcomes. The following year, Levine stated that this game would be a first-person science fiction game similar to System Shock, which is something he also worked on. Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor, in particular, its Nemesis system was cited as one of the game's inspirations. That's interesting. I've said before, Nemesis system, one of the biggest innovations in all of gaming, and it's basically been unused since 2017. So we're going to get the Wonder Woman game that's going to use it. So that could be really cool. The other interesting thing is that Ghost Story Games is underneath Take-Two Interactive. So Monolith, these guys underneath Warner Brothers, they had the Nemesis system trademarked and like copyrighted. I forget exactly what they did, but basically they legally protected it so that you couldn't use it. But they've described for their Wonder Woman game that they're going to be using the Nemesis system within it, which I don't know what that looks like, but apparently they will be. So we'll see a new version of that. However, this means that as a result, they can't just use the Nemesis system or a version of it in Judas, but seeing that it's an inspiration for it, it's interesting because maybe they're talking about dynamically generated NPCs and stories or something. I don't know. It could be interesting. But whenever you hear something described as in development hell, that's rough. And specifically, the group that reported that was Bloomberg, Jason Schreier specifically, and he has a very, very good track record for this stuff. A very, very good track record with reporting this stuff. So to hear him say it was supposed to be out in 2017, that's rough. That's rough. A game arriving 7 years late, possibly 8 years late, because they're saying they expect it to come out latest. They're saying latest March of 2025 at the latest. Judas will be released on Microsoft Windows via Steam and Epic. Take-Two Interactive, Ghostwriter or Ghost Stories owner, expects the game to be released by March 25 at the latest. I'm just saying, there's some games that are in development hell that end up being great. It technically can happen. Technically. But what do we call a game that's been in development hell for like 7-8 years? We call that a big old red flag. I'll tell you what. I'll tell you what. I hope it's great. But whenever a game has been in development and stuck like that for so long, it usually shows mismanagement. And this is just the common thing that we've seen. Yeah, Skull and Bones could be amazing. Will it be amazing? We'll see. But it's a red flag. Thank you, Deep. Yes, it's a red flag. It's a big red flag. So you just have to be very skeptical of these types of things, okay? Because everywhere that Ken Levine seems to go, the company is plagued with mismanagement. And I think it's because he's a great game designer. He is not a very good manager. And I know we all, trust me, I get it. We all love to bash on like on managers because everybody's always like, yeah, managers, especially bad ones, they're usually just people that were bad at the job, but were good at schmoozing the higher ups. So they get the job as the boss and they end up making more money than the people doing the actual work. And that's absolutely the case with a lot of bosses and a lot of situations like that. But at the same time, there are occasions where you have somebody that is really good at their job or really good at what they're doing and is also a great leader and motivator. And like, I think Hidetaka Miyazaki is a phenomenal example, an amazing game designer. And he also apparently is able to run a very tight ship at From Software, like very, very tight ship. They have a very efficient team that's able to put together some massive games that are consistently some of the best reviewed games of the year. And he's basically created his own genre around the games that he's designed. He's able to do this consistently for years and years and years and years and years. And Ken Levine, very gifted game designer, but it seems like he's missing that other part, which is being able to lead and manage a group of people. And it's why usually you need like the creative type paired with the business type. You need the way Steve Wozniak, the co-founder of Apple, he described it in a speech I remember hearing in college, where he was like, every amazing company and team needs the hippie and the nerd. He said you need the hippie that's got the vision and is the creative type and can kind of see the broader picture and think very differently. And then you need the nerd who can keep him on track and confront him with reality when it's not convenient for him, you know? And that's what you need. You need that balance. Some people are gifted enough and talented enough that they can come in and they can balance it and they can do both. Others are not like that. You know, it's just a little bit different. Alan Wake was a game that was in development hell and turned out great. Yeah, like I said, sometimes it can work. Sometimes they click together. The original Bioshock Infinite is another great example from Ken Levine, where he had a game in development hell and it ended up being a lot of people's favorite game of the year and a game they still go back and play regularly that they love and cherish. Was that a red flag? Yeah, that was a point against it. The game just ended up being so good, it outweighed the red flag, you know? So I think that that's just important to keep in mind. All of this to say, the whole thing with Judas and with Bioshock is just fascinating because it is an amazingly accomplished developer at the helm of these studios. It is a franchise in the form of Bioshock that's just made tons of money and has been very, very successful. And yet they just seemingly cannot figure out what to do with it or how to make it function consistently well. As for the future of Bioshock, 2K formally announced in December of 2019 that a new Bioshock title was under development and was still some years from release. The game is being developed by a new internal studio, Cloud Chamber, with offices based in San Fran, which is 2K Marin's old offices, and a newly established location in Montreal. The studio is led by Kelly Gilmore, who had previously worked at Fire Access. The lead staff include art director Scott Sinclair, who had worked on the first Bioshock, and Jonathan Pelling as design director, having previously done level work for Bioshock and Infinite, and Hogarth de la Plante as creative director after having worked on other Bioshock games in numerous roles. So you can see for 2K, they're like, Bioshock is a huge asset for us, an amazing IP, and we are just going to, we're going to get a sequel out, we're going to do it, but we're going to put a team on it that we think can do it without falling into development hell, which I just find really, really interesting. As of right now, like, there really is not a whole lot to say about this. They are working on it, and we'll see. There has been basically no news since 2019. And if we go to their website, you see Bioshock, Bioshock 2, Bioshock Infinite, and next, whatever is next. They say they're hiring systems designers, technical producers, pipeline technical animator. What worries me about that is that, like, systems designers, my understanding after a lot of reading and studying in this field, systems designers are primarily doing their work in the early stages of development. They design the systems to be used in the game. And so once the systems are done, you can design the rest of the game, basically. So to see that they're still hiring is a little concerning for me. But maybe it's just an old job posting, or maybe they're preparing for something else. Who knows? But you can see it's a relatively small team. It's a dynamic team, but then they also have some people there that have worked on the original Bioshock games. So it could be amazing. It could be great, but we've not heard anything in going on 5 years, which should be plenty. They announced they're working on it. A lot of AAA games take about 5 years nowadays. Who knows? Maybe we're going to see it soon. Maybe this summer we see a trailer drop for it for the next Bioshock. That'd be great. That'd be great. But time will tell. But it's just a fascinating tale of one of the lead franchises and designers in our industry. And it is still just so plagued by something as stupid as mismanagement. You can have an amazingly talented group of people, but if you have bad management, the whole thing can collapse. And it's a similar thing I think we've seen with many other studios, many other big publishers. I think you've seen it at like Activision in the steady decline of Call of Duty and the quality there. You've seen it at Blizzard with the collapse of the management and leadership there, to the point where it's just a toxic hellscape, according to some people, to work there. You saw mismanagement within Ubisoft. We've seen mismanagement within Bethesda Game Studios, not to the same degree as elsewhere, but we just specifically with like no design documentation, no clarity on the project's vision and stuff like that. And it leads to games that are significantly worse than they could have been otherwise. And it's just a very interesting discussion to have, I think.
He took my thing.